And good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for showing an interest in attending our first National Evaluation and Learning Partnership Capacity Building Workshop on building explanatory frameworks, program theories, accounts. We weren't 100% sure what to title this session around, but as we move forward, it will become a little bit more clearer. Because as Katie was saying, we're kind of very much learning from this process as well, in terms of our involvement. So for those of you who don't know me, most of you do, there's a fair few of my Essex colleagues in the room. My name's Kev Harris and I'm part of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership. So working with Katie around this work, particularly around building capacity, training, learning environments. My main role, I work at Hartpury University in Gloucester, although I live in Southampton, and I work very closely with Essex LDP, where I head up the Evaluation Consortium. So really delighted to be here today. Kate, I think Katie is known by everyone, but Katie, did you want to introduce yourself really quickly, or?
Yeah, no, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm just to it's my fault. I brought together this consortium of people, Kev and Lewis and Rob and others from Sheffield Hallam. Gemma's on the call today as well, to be part of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership. And we've been trying to work with different pilots and starting to work with different places to support evaluation and learning in this most complex of challenges that we're all working together. So my background is in realist research, and before I was working in physical activity, I was looking at sexual health, and so I come with some, different sort of viewpoints which aren't necessarily just about physical activity, but just about how do we work together with other partners across systems to support people to live well and to thrive. So that's where I'm coming from, and just reiterate what I said at the beginning, in that we have got things that we want to share with you and to talk through with you, but we recognise your own experience and what you value in evaluation and learning as well, and just really welcome you to bring that to the fore as well. The way that we're going to do this session is going to be in three main parts. The first is I'm going to introduce a little bit about what we mean by explanatory frameworks and program theories, why we think those are important, and then I'll pause and just get an opportunity for you to ask further questions or to discuss that. And then I've got an example that comes from Sheffield, so it's not a local delivery pilot, but hopefully it brings some of what we're introducing by way of kind of ideas to life with an example. And Kev's going to kind of facilitate that and sort of just ask me some awkward questions and put me on the spot a little bit to try and explain that. And then we'll be passing over to you guys to work in smaller groups to start thinking about how you might develop these explanatory frameworks or program theories. And you may have bare bones of those already, or you may have them well worked up, but it's just an opportunity to share those with others and to explain them and to get some questioning, because what we've really been learning is that there aren't necessarily exactly right or wrong answers, but it's in working together and exchanging those ideas that we get closer to something which we feel is appropriate, and then we can test that with further data. So just really encourage those discussions. So that's what we're going to run through today. Is that okay with everybody? Does everybody feel happy? So so I guess one kind of word of encouragement is to, as I'm going through this, start to think, how might I apply this in my work? How might I actually practically do this myself? And that might help you with further questions, or it might help you just get some ideas ready for that breakout group later on. Okay.
Brilliant. Great. So Katie, you can you've got powers to share your presentation, have you?
I've got powers, I hope so.
Yeah. Okay, so when you're ready, there you go. Brilliant.
Right, brilliant. So I can still see all of you. Okay, so excellent. Let's crack on through these slides then, first set. Okay, so the first point and the first way that I wanted to sort of bring this to life for you is to think about a complex systems. Now, these are, sometimes feel like quite jargony type words. What do we mean by complex? What even is a system? And I just wanted to bring that to life with thinking about an ecosystem, something which is natural out in the wilds, and then also perhaps a system which is perhaps a little bit more managed with regards to a garden here. And what we can see when we look at an ecosystem is there are patterns of how things tend to work. So we see that there are, there's a valley here, there are trees and things on the horizon. We start to learn where certain trees might grow, where certain damp patches might arrive. And then we can transfer some of that learning into how we might manage a garden. But we don't treat, sorry, could I just ask whoever it is to just mute, just because I'm getting a bit of feedback. But we don't, when we grow in a garden, we don't manage everything in exactly the same way and plant everything in exactly the same place and treat it with the same amount of water. We look at the context that the garden is sat in and we think about, well, here's a bit of shade, and so we need to think about what planting we might put there. Here's a bit of, a drier soil or a clay soil, so what plant might go there? How do we nurture this plant might be different from how we nurture this plant. And so I'm hoping that you can transfer that kind of idea to what we mean when we're talking about a system regarding physical activity. So how do all of the things in the context come together to produce the patterns that we might see in our environment, in our settings, and then how might we intervene might be different in different circumstances dependent on those patterns that we see. So when we talk about systems, we don't talk about things that work in a linear fashion. We don't think, okay, well, we'll just put in a plant there and then it will grow and then we'll get some fruit. It's much more complex than that. There's lots of things that we need to take into consideration. There's what we call feedback loops where, say there's a pest that gets onto that plant, we need to deal with that, otherwise it would affect the whole plant. There's all those things that we need to think about. And I know that most of you will have attended training on complex systems behaviours and have heard of terms like non-linearity and that kind of thing before. So I'm not going to go over that in detail now, but I just want you to bear in mind that that's where we're coming from. That's our starting point with this work. Okay, so here we are just thinking about, bear in mind that, we're working in complex systems. That here might be a simplified model of a complex intervention then. So we've got an intervention, something that we put into that environment, and it might be a project. And I know there's lots of Essex colleagues here, and there's lots of projects going on in Essex, and they're thinking about how that might sort of sit within their different settings. And it's not just a straightforward line, A plus B equals C. There's lots of intervening things and interacting parts that can lead to those outcomes. And then when we think about a systems approach and thinking about how do we intervene in systems, potentially you could even see that being even a little bit more complex, in that there's multiple inputs. There are things that sort of sit outside the system that have a bearing on what goes on inside the system, such as national policy, for example, or a global pandemic. And then you get multiple outputs as well. So again, I'm just drawing this into a simplified model of just to help understanding and to bridge some of the gaps between what do we see in systems and then how can we make sense of them. So if that's what systems are, and that's what that kind of mix of interacting parts, shall we say, to bring about the outcomes that we might see, how can we know about it? How can we actually develop a knowledge base? So there's lots of different evaluation or research designs, but I just wanted to talk about 4 kind of types of research design to just build us into why we think an explanatory research design is important. So some research designs are exploratory, so really that's when we know nothing at all about something and we might be just going to gain some familiarity, and typically what we do there is we observe a lot, we might do some sort of deep dive inquiries, but really what we're trying to do is just get a handle on that subject at all. We might use a descriptive design, and that's where what we're starting to ask is a little bit more about, you know, what is happening and where is it happening and when is it happening. But our task there is really to provide quite a detailed account of what we see and what we observe. On the other end of the scale is the kind of what we might describe as a conclusive research design. And that's where we see them quite typically in things like randomized controlled trials. And that's where we've got some hypotheses about how we think change is happening. But what we're looking for in our research design is verification that our hypothesis is either right or wrong. And so we set up an experiment, essentially, where in one setting we've got the intervention, and in another setting we haven't got the intervention, and dependent on the results we then try to make a conclusion about whether our intervention worked or not. Now, what I was saying earlier about complex systems is that there are, you know, especially the kind of work that Lotte, you are doing, is that there are so many open influences in and out of that system that complexity is very hard to control for. So we might argue that it's hard to, almost impossible to set up that kind of conclusive experimental design because of the sheer volume of interacting parts that might be sort of might be occurring within that setting. So what can we do? So we would argue that what we can do is we can identify and try to explain some of the patterns that we see within the system. So we don't necessarily strive for an absolute statement of truth that one thing is right or not, but we look for patterns in how changes may or may not come about. And then we really closely ask ourselves why. Why is it happening this way and not that way? Why is it happening in that circumstance and not another circumstance? And then if we've really sort of asked ourselves those questions and then sought external data to help confirm or disconfirm our theories, we start to get a better and increasingly nuanced understanding of how change comes about. I'm just going to pause for a moment there to see if there's any questions on what we've covered thus far. Is everyone still with me? Yeah, thumbs up from Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate that. Right, let's move on then to the topic of today. Oh, my animation's out of kilter. Sorry, apologise for that. So we might describe this then as an evolution of evaluation to account for that complexity that we now recognise in the world. And I do encourage you to sort of, if you're interested in this topic more broadly, is to look at some of the work of people like Michael Quinn Patton, who's done some work on utility-focused evaluation and also developmental evaluation, and has now started to build up some understanding around transformative evaluation. And what Michael Quinn Patton has been saying is that we've taken our understanding of evaluation processes and methods, and it's been really helpful. So things like theory of change have been really helpful for us to understand how some more simple processes might work to bring about changes. But the nature of the challenges that we are now trying to unearth and understand, such as physical inactivity, are so complex that those theory of change models can only take us so far. And so this is the journey that we're on, trying to sort of really to push the boundaries of evaluation now into so that it's as appropriate as it can be for that complex setting. So I'll just read out this quote for you. And again, another really great resource is the betterevaluation.org website. So the evolution of evaluation to account for complexity. The need for relevant, credible and useful information continues to increase. It is more imperative than ever that evaluations contribute to understanding the complexities of an innovation, are adaptive and responsive to new and evolving questions and learning, and that they reflect the changes, challenges and opportunities that emerge as the innovation unfolds. So I guess that's our challenge, that's our kind of clarion call, isn't it? Is that how do we develop an evaluation that can do all of those things? And as Kev and I mentioned earlier, that we believe that a realist approach can help to bring about some of that understanding. But I'm not going to go into lots of detail about realist approaches today, because I do know that the jargon and some of the concepts can be a little bit challenging as an introduction. So we're going to talk about some of the principles of realism, but not necessarily by talking about realism themselves. So you may have heard of things like context, mechanism, outcomes, configurations. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but just to highlight that is something that kind of informs what Kev and I do. What we're trying to do here is to bring about some of those principles and ways of working and ways of thinking without worrying too much about the sort of technical jargon of the kind of academic approach. I hope that's okay for everybody. I'm hoping it will be okay for everybody. And then the other sort of point to highlight here is that instead of thinking about that linear model of A plus B equals C, what we're attending to is the kind of complex web of potentially causal processes that bring about the change. Okay, so what do I mean by an explanatory framework, first of all, and then later I'm going to go to what do we mean by program theories or explanatory accounts. So first of all, the framework. So a framework, again, lots of these words have got different meanings, and so all we're doing here is not saying definitively this is what it is. We're just saying, Kev and I are saying, this is how we want to think about it in this work that we do together. So an explanatory framework used to help understand complex events and situations. So the framework itself, it just brings about some of the components that we think are important for the change or for the study that we're doing. It in itself isn't the explanation, as it were. It's more of a representation of the things that we think are interesting and useful. So, for example, this is obviously a very famous model or framework here, which is the London Tube map. You know, we all know that that isn't what it actually looks like in reality. If we go on the tube, you know, we're not sort of boxed into these, you know, specific little red lines or whatever it might be. But it's a representation to help us understand how the tube system works. And so it's a kind of a model which helps bridge our understanding from what the actual reality is to what we can understand about it so that it's useful. So that's the kind of real sort of key point about frameworks, is that they're really only as good as their utility, the extent to which they help you understand the whole and also the parts within the whole. So whilst the frameworks might provide this kind of abstract picture of all the relevant things that we're interested in, or that they don't actually provide that explanation, the program theories, if you imagine, are kind of situated within the framework, and they are what actually help us to, or what we use to outline our specific ideas about how a program or parts of a program might cause or bring about the intended or observed outcomes. So I'll just stop and say that again. So whilst you've got the framework, which gives you the domains and the bits that we're interested in, the program theories are almost like a zoom in, which then think, well, if we were interested in how this part of the system works with this part of the system, let's be explicit about how we think that might affect a change or influence some change. And then the program theory is effectively the written format of that idea, making explicit those assumptions.
Katie, just coming in there, which obviously we said that I would.
Yeah.
Throughout the conversation, is sometimes in my experience when we talk about theory or we mention that word theory, it does create a barrier or a challenge. It's almost like, what's that? And it can be quite scary for some people. So could you just break down what we mean by theory, or what you mean by theory?
Yeah, no, thank you, Kev. That's a great introduction. Yeah, so from our point of view, a theory is simply the idea that, you know, it really is just make the idea that you might hold in your head about how something works made explicit and shareable with somebody else. So it's not a grand theory. It's, you know, it's not a, you know, it's not something that we're trying to say is, you know, even necessarily like world breaking or completely innovative. It's just being very explicit about the idea of how you think change may come about. Is that helpful, Kev? Okay, and as I say, Claire Hannah Russell.
Thanks, Katie. When we talk about theories as being those sorts of ideas or hunches, is it the case that one of the sort of shortfalls of many other approaches, that like the four that you've three of the four that you've outlined here, that the shortfall is that we rarely hear about the program theories, and that's a real issue when we're understanding how programs can be scaled up, replicated, explored further, etc. Is that the thinking sort of that's inspiring us to do this work from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting viewpoint. I would say with the exploratory and the descriptive research designs, there's not necessarily a desire to explain. That's not necessarily their intention. So they have value, but they're not necessarily designed to do that level of explanation. I think that very often with a conclusive research design or a randomized control type design, there is a theory and that is explicit, but it tends to just it focuses on a quite what we might call a linear theory. So it really it's not necessarily comprehensive of all of the different influential factors that are going on. So it's essentially assuming that that in order to test our idea, we can get rid of all of the other context and we don't need to worry about the other context, because all we're interested in is, does our idea work to bring about a change? And I think that's then what you're saying, Claire, is that the problem comes in that even if we are able to do that controlled trial, when we then come to try to implement that intervention in the real world, we don't know, because we've controlled out for all of the context that might be influencing the change. So we don't actually know how to implement that and to scale it. So even if it's feasible to do that conclusive design, it can actually be, lack the usefulness that we need when we come to actually roll it out and to scale it up. Yes, Claire, I think that was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so what makes a good explanatory framework, and then what makes a good program theory? And again, I mean, I could go on and on, but I'm trying to sort of here just think about what are the key components. So if we go back to the simplified model of the system that we showed earlier, a good explanatory framework would be sufficiently inclusive of the key parts that we think are important. It doesn't mean exhaustively inclusive, because if we were to detail everything, then we'd end up in just such a complex spaghetti junction of connections that actually it starts to lack that utility that I mentioned earlier. It would support a transfer of meaning from one setting to another. So sometimes that means that it's sufficiently, and another word here which might be a bit novel for people, but abstract. So rather than it being very, very super detailed about the specific setting, it actually is kind of like a slightly zoomed out or slightly blurry version of it, so that we can actually transfer some of those ideas from one place to another. That it makes an attempt to separate some of the individual components. So here I've just done them in letters. Oh, I recognise that there's a big gap in the middle there as well. So there normally should be a letter here. So the letters to signify the parts that might be interacting, but then it also provides a kind of unified, coherent model of the whole. So it's something that is flexible enough to be able to show you that whole picture as well as the individual component parts. And then really importantly for this work is that it's adaptable. So as we sort of dive into one area of the framework and understand it better, we actually might recognise that no, that connection isn't like that. It actually is a one-way connection, or the connection is somewhere completely different, or it's influenced by something else. So it's something that you can adapt and iterate over time. And what makes a good program theory? So in that might relate to one or multiple theories, might relate to many of these different interrelationships, but it's an attempt to be a detailed causal theory. So causal here, all I mean is that it makes a claim as to how things do lead to change, and assume that there is a actual causal effect, a cause and effect that can be at least theorized, if not known. That is configurational. Now, again, that's another technical term, but what we mean here is that it pays attention to how the different mix of things in a setting might interact, and it isn't just a very sort of simple connection, and is testable. So when you're actually making those accounts or those explanations, it's something that you could go out and test through the gathering of more data. And we're not going to cover this in lots of detail today, but when we talk about data here, we might be talking about quantitative or numbers-based data that comes from observations, or we might be talking about subjective data or data that comes from conversations or from interviews or workshops, and the data that is sort of there in the system as well, so like the stories that people might tell, their experiences, their perceptions. So all of those different kinds of data can be used to help test a program theory or an explanatory account. Right. Okay, I'm not going to detail this slide because there's obviously lots in it, but when we share these slides afterwards, these are questions that you can ask yourself and your teams to help you to get towards a more explanatory focus in your work. So I'm not going to go over these details now, but in our next bit, when I go through the example, then Kev will be asking me some of these questions, so you can kind of see how it works in practice. So I think I'm going to pause there to just see if there's quite a lot of content there, quite a lot of technical content, and just to get a sense of whether that feels familiar, whether there are some areas that need a bit more detail before we move on.
Katie, just as people are plucking up the courage to ask the question or ponder what their question may be, based on those slides that you've just gone through, what would you say are the key take-homes or key 3 or 4 things that kind of really come out as a message from that first part of your discussion?
Yeah, no, great question, Kev. For me, I think it's about the biggest and strongest kind of message, I would say, is an orientation towards explaining rather than just kind of counting or, pointing at change. So because of that complexity, which, can sometimes feel hugely overwhelming, I'm sure we've all been there where everyone's thinking, how on earth can we make sense of this? The kind of saving grace and the way that we can accumulate knowledge is, I believe, is through recognition of patterns and explaining those patterns. And then those things will start to be able to transfer from place to place and get a richer understanding of it. So it's not a question of definite proof or conclusions. It's more about an increasingly nuanced understanding of how things may work and the context and situations in which they do work. So that if there's only one thing to take away from this session, is it's an orientation towards explaining that we would really love to encourage. And if anyone feels that that's kind of difficult or outside of what they either feel comfortable to do or are able to do for other reasons, then it'd be really useful to sort of understand that, so that we know what we need to put in place to perhaps help.
Thanks, Katie. Does anyone have any specific questions for Katie at all?
Laura.
Hi, Katie. I was just wondering about how a pilot would hold several different explanatory frameworks and how they would necessarily talk to each other or interact. So given you would have maybe several of these depending on what you were looking at any given time, and just, how they would interact with one another. Yeah.
So do you mean that you might have a framework? Just could you give me an example of the kind of things you might be thinking of? So are you thinking about different work streams, or are you thinking about different audiences?
I'm not sure whether I've thought that enough through. Sorry, Katie. I was just thinking around. I guess in a typical theory of change, we were trying to throw everything into it, and it almost it cover everything at once, and perhaps not in the nuance or the detail that you've been describing this morning. So I think the question for me was how do we maybe have several of these, depending on how, it could be work stream. Yeah, I think work stream, but you might correct me on that.
No, I mean it can be work stream, but so typically what we see in any kind of complex intervention that are working through either a realist or using these explanatory accounts, is you have nested frameworks. So you might have a framework which is quite a simplified model of the overall pattern of change. And I haven't got it on this slide, but if we have time at the end, I can show you one that we're developing for the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, which is nested. So just to give you an example of what that looks like, is it's got how projects might work to bring about change. It's got how working with other sectors might work to bring about change. It's got how strengthening community and individual capacities might work to bring about change. And then it's got how tackling structural inequalities might work to bring about change. And that's nested because the structural inequalities is kind of the biggest cause of physical inactivity, but actually quite hard to affect any change into. And it gets sort of smaller and smaller and smaller. When I go through the example here, you can see that how some of the program theories allow us to connect the dots between those different nested models. There's not a kind of precise science about it though, Laura, and I think really the focus here needs to be utility. So don't just develop framework after framework after framework for everything possible. Think about what am I trying to explain? What are the important parts of what I'm trying to explain within this particular aspect of the work? And start from that point of view. And then how does it relate to the whole? How does it relate to any of the other parts as well? In realist kind of scholarship, there's quite a kind of forerunner of the approach, a woman she's a practical jobbing evaluator as well, a lady called Jill Westhorpe. And she's basically suggested that some of her projects have even as many as 17 different models, but she only is working on one of them and detailing one aspect of one of them at a time. But then when you've got that bit of extra detail about that thing, and then feeds back into the other models and changes the other models. So it is about this kind of interaction between the models and the theories, seeking ever more, ever better explanations over time.
That's really helpful, thank you. I think it was around how they hang off as central. Hang off's not the right frame, but almost zoom into a particular challenge or tension, and then zoom out to what is effectively something that's more holistic, I guess.
That does tend to be how I work. Is the whole and then parts and then whole and then parts, rather than process for the frameworks, whole and then parts, rather than process along a kind of pathway, as it were.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great question, Laura. Thank you. Should we carry on, Kev?
Yeah, let's go. Cheers, Katie.
Okay. Right, so I'll just introduce this project, and to be honest, some of you may start to feel familiar, because some of the themes that I'll talk about I know are things that you're doing in your own pilots, and so if some of what I say resonates with you, you can just take my theory. That's fine, you can have it, because the idea is it's meant to be transferable. So this is a project which is about the This Girl Can campaign, but how it was implemented within Sheffield, and here's just a lovely splash that they made in the newspaper with the work that they were doing. And I'll just briefly explain. So this is a really simplified version of the explanatory framework. So in Sheffield, they thought, well, how are we going to actually utilise the investment from Sport England to support more women to be more active? And we had 4 different settings, community-based settings. And the basic idea was that they wanted to develop peer support, such that women were encouraging other women within that sort of small geographic area, that the investment would provide a way of bringing the insight that the sort of the knowledge of the cultural sort of barriers or preferences that the officers had to the fore and into the sort of decision making around what was developed and what was put on, and coordinated with the local setting, and that the investment, rather than us specifying how they were to use the money to deliver XYZ number of sessions, for example, that the investment was really to give some capacity so that officers working in those community sector organisations were able to respond to what they saw and what ideas were kind of coming up and available to people. Okay. So shall I just keep going, Kev, in terms of, do you want to just ask questions if they come up?
Yeah,
okay.
That's great. Thanks,
so very broadly speaking, what are we trying to do? So whilst it was a community-based organisation, what we were trying to do is get physical activity into the community work. So we might describe that as being a technocratic or a policy solution to embed physical activity as usual practice in community organisations. And the objective of what we were trying to achieve was that physical activity would be a key tool within that community development work. So it's quite similar in some of the other examples that we've given in local pilots about physical activity being part of the delivery or part of the policy within different sectors. And what did we see? So this is just really sort of straightforward in terms of what actually happened on that project. We did see physical activity became a key tool in community development work. There were more and a greater variety of physical activity sessions. We saw physical activity introduced into non-physical activity sessions, like a kind of cooking group, and then they would go for a walk as well. Really encouragingly, we saw physical activity formalised as part of someone's role that went beyond the This Girl Can campaign time and was part of the strategy for that voluntary sector organisation. And because they were doing so well at actually connecting with and encouraging local women, it was attractive to, that should be national governing bodies. So it was attractive to some of the national governing bodies like UK Cycling and cricket. So that was what was happening overall. So that you would say, well, that's no different from what, a normal kind of theory of change. But I'm now going to start to get into some of these more details that help us to sort of explain the change. So first of all, the question is, what actually influenced change? And what we saw was two of the organisations did lead to physical activity being part of the key tool in community development work, but two of the organisations it didn't become part of the community development work. So the question is not to say does it work or not, it's to say why did it work in one place and why did it not work in the other place. So let's just dig into that a little bit more. So all of them were the same in the sense that they all had a forum for women to share ideas. Now, they had different executions of that. One had a WhatsApp group and one had a Facebook group, for example, but it was effectively trying to do the same thing, to build up that trust, social connectedness, and ultimately motivation through peer encouragement. They all had that flexibility and partnership working with Move More. So that's the whole system approach to physical activity in Sheffield, for information. And they all had that capacity that we mentioned at the beginning, so that they had a kind of freedom to respond to the different needs and opportunities. But as I said before, even though all four of them had that as part of their approach, still we saw some that didn't actually transpire into to be a key tool. So really the important thing for us to know is like, okay, so what was it about those others that did facilitate that change? So first of all, the community officer was passionate about physical activity in all of the different places, but in two of them, they also had knowledge of the community development approach. So that's about, you know, how you actually work with individuals and communities, a person-centered approach, and build them up and build a wider picture of their needs and what they might need to actually to be supported into physical activity. And that, alongside the passion for physical activity, would seem to be the right combination. They also had long-standing relationships with other staff and volunteers, and that allowed them to bring in more resources, but also increase the relevance for clients. And then they also recognised this was during the pandemic, so one of the sort of big kind of contexts meant that people couldn't physically get together at that time. So they also had the flexibility and also the tenacity to support people to become digitally included. So it just reduced those barriers to participation. So in the two areas that worked, those were additional things that were in place that helped bring about the change. And then following on from that, they then saw these instances of impact in community engagement and participation, but also the staff members that were engaged in that work got a great deal of satisfaction and happiness from being part of it. And so those two things combined led to a higher level of senior organisational interest, signifying value and commitment to physical activity as part of the overall kind of offer of the voluntary community sector organisation, which led to further resources, capacity and further opportunity. So I'm hoping that gives you a bit of a flavour as to like the kind of inquiry to really get into understanding actually how is this change happening in one context and not in another? What is the kind of key components?
And that's what I was going to just touch upon, Katie, as well, is that obviously one of the big things that we obviously are passionate about here is the role that context plays in all of these things. So was there anything else particularly distinctive about context, or maybe it might be useful? I know you briefly alluded to it at the start, but just to kind of really break down what we mean by context, because a lot of the time we use the term context, don't we? So that sometimes can be interpreted in different ways. Yeah,
I mean, context. So first of all, context is active. For us, context is active. So it's not something that sort of sits in the passive. You know, it's not the it was in Darnell. You know, like it's not relevant that it's just a kind of geographic context. It's actually, you know, so what's the point of that? Of that feature of the system that is having an influence or not. So it's only interesting to us if we think it's having an influence. Then context can sit at kind of various different layers. So it can be individual context, which is about a person's own skills, knowledge, capability, opportunities, that kind of thing. It can be interpersonal. So we talk often about historic relationships. You know, so here I've got the fact that the ones where it was successful, they had that relationship with the staff and volunteers. So that's an interpersonal context that was relevant. It can be organisational, and it can be also infrastructural. So that means, you know, we are looking about lots of different various layers of context and how they may influence. But the key thing is that they do have an influence, not that we're not just describing, you know, that the sky is blue. It's how is that relevant to the change or not? Claire?
Thanks, Katie. Katie, if I was sort of a program manager or setting up a program, and I saw that you had findings there like tenacity and adapting, you know, that some of the professionals or people were able to get people sort of engaged digitally, etc. I'd be thinking about elements of resilience and adaptation to context. So, you know, for example, the COVID adaptation and that tenacity to me equals community and individual resilience, and also probably community and individual well-being. In this sort of situation, would that be valid or reasonable, do you think, to actually capture some data on that to test and example this point?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, I think herein lies the value in sharing that with somebody else, and somebody else saying, well, that to me looks like this kind of trait or this kind of, you know, feature that we might be interested in, and that we can develop some data around. So the data that we've used to sort of bring these findings together have largely been from qualitative data, from observations, and from collective sense-making sessions where we actually brought the community, the organisations themselves together to discuss why they thought things were working in one place and not in another. But in terms of actually scaling this up or thinking about, you know, where are the right contexts to do this in more detail, then sure, you know, things like, you know, looking for those kind of traits in existing organisations might really be a helpful thing to do.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I just pressed the wrong button. And let's move on. Okay, so and that's kind of what I was going to say is that sure, now we've got a great explanation as to why change happened, but what's the point? You know, so you know what does that mean for this system that carries on? They're still in post. So this was the sense-making session where they were talking about who, you know, what's really worked. And what we found was that the ones that where it wasn't really working were adopting some of the ideas from the ones where it was working, but they weren't adopting them wholesale and saying, you know, oh, well, we just need this lady here, Nur, we just need a Nur in our place. What they were doing was saying, well, what is it about Nur that's managed to actually to achieve that? What do we have in our place which is similar to that, and who else could we work with? And so this level of detail and understanding has allowed for transfer of ideas to other places, and it's also been some of the things that have been built into the Move More strategy, which is, you know, a recognition, for example, of, yeah, I think all I'm saying is that it you know, what's the value of that kind of level of explanation? Well, it's allowed us to explain how this really works in a community setting, which has then had a impact on the Move More strategy and how we fund community sector organisations in Sheffield to really to give that capacity and that allow for people to build up those relationships in post. Okay, and so going back to what you were saying, Claire, before, is that, you know, the adaptability of the framework. So we've got those detailed programme theories now, but what we've recognised is the need to actually develop that framework further, because it's not just about peer support and women encouraging each other. Now we know a bit more about what are the sort of parts that need to be in place in order to really make that work, have that community development approach, and then to sort of maintain that capacity and adaptability is really about partnership and senior level buy-in. And the final little bit on this one is that is again because it's an emergent approach, it's not just to think about, okay, it's a project, it started, it stopped, it finished, here's the answers. It's as actually what else did it lead to? So there are now in those areas more opportunities for physical activity more often, but also because they were adapted to those community and cultural kind of relevance, it started to change attitudes about who should be active in certain communities and who can use green space. So they had hijabi wearing women playing cricket on a pitch which is normally used just by the young kids, and that's having a kind of effect on who's actually the space for. And then it's also had this level of supporting the officers themselves with job security and job fulfillment, and these are officers from the community themselves, and that's actually, you know, actually tackling some of the root cause of inactivity by providing them with opportunities. Okay, so that's the example. Obviously, I know that I've spoken quite a lot of time. I'm just wondering whether, first of all, whether actually the example was ringing any bells for other people who've been working in this space, and if so, if anyone feels willing to sort of unmute and just to give an example where they have seen something similar in their setting.
I really like that you can bring in terms like tenacity, because sometimes it feels like it's a bit of an intangible thing, or it's a bit fluffy, but yet without those individuals with tenacity, and somebody, was it Claire, mentioned resilience as well, and I thought that's so integral, and yet it's something that's missed out sometimes because it's it could be even a personality trait, but you need those individuals, and then to build on that with the idea of a critical mass of such individuals. I think that's really encouraging that those things are relevant and we can capture them.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
And I think that helps us to identify as well the types of the qualities and the resources people have to make these projects work the way that they do, that sometimes are not always made explicit. So this really helps us to make that explicit, doesn't it?
Exactly that. Yeah, the individual qualities and values. This is just my opinion, and quite often the starting point, aren't they? I'm biased. Katie will know that. But thank you, that's really helpful.
Right, we've got Emily with her hands up as well. Emily.
Yeah, and just want to sort of reflect that with the term enabler. Like, we're doing a lot of work on having at all levels people identify what are enablers, whether it's part of a piece of research or their own sort of professional reflection. Just getting that language into all the way through our networks, right down to our delivery partners, and starting to use that language. And so it's really nice to see it here, because we think it's landing well through our systems.
Really interesting, Emily. Thanks for that. So are there any other enablers that you have recognised or that are starting to land well that you can share?
Okay, so we're early on, but the things that are coming out are, yes, connectedness, something I really want to dive into. So if anybody's got any, we were actually looking to start a load of surveys on how it feels to be connected. So if anybody's got anything, that'd be a good thing to share. Protecting time it is becoming an enabler. Of course, communication, but we're going to sort of dissect that in different ways, ways of communicating, and creativeness, creative engagement, freedom to be wrong. And we also follow up a lot of those questions with, what went wrong? Let's share those scripts.
Amazing. So that to me, those are elements that could form a bit of an explanatory framework, Emily. And what I would encourage you to do is actually to be explicit about what, how and why do we think those enablers help us in this systems change work. And that's where you get that connection between the kind of the boxes and the kind of domains and the features, and then the actual explanation, which you can test through those gathering that data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Super. Okay, Kev, shall we move to shall I explain the task and then we'll move to breakouts?
Yeah, go for it, Katie. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so if you remember the earlier on, we talked about the explanatory emphasis, and I'm not going to ask you to ask each other all of these different questions in half an hour's time. But what we're asking you to do is in smaller group breakouts, and I don't think Kev and I can be able to facilitate all of them. So I am really asking you to do some self-facilitation here because of the way that it will break down, is to start having a practice at this explanatory focus. And I've highlighted 3 questions, which I think are a sort of starting point. So what are we trying to do? And you can just describe that. You don't necessarily need to sort of, it doesn't need to be chapter and verse, but just really kind of clearly, what's the kind of key thing we're trying to do? I would say focus on one thing within your systems. Don't necessarily try and focus on the whole thing at this moment in time. We're really focusing on that smaller sort of part of it. Then think about, can you actually identify the mix of things that are enabling or constraining change? You might not be exhaustive here, but it's just get a sense of it from what you've observed or what data you've collected thus far. And then I think if we just cover those 2 questions, when we come back, we might talk about, well, what's the core of what we're trying to understand? But I think let's just do those 2 questions to begin with, just as a way of practicing. And if you're finding it difficult, I just encourage you to just really talk it through with each other, and accept other people's viewpoints on those things, because that's where we get quite a lot of that richness of the explanation.
And I think, if anything, a lot of the things that I've picked up from getting around and meeting a lot of the local delivery pilots is the opportunity to talk to someone else from another local delivery pilot, which is really beneficial here. So just that that in itself, I think, will be great. Emily, you got your hand up, or was that up anyway?
Historic hand.
Oh, historic hand. I like that. Brilliant.
Sorry,
Okay.
yeah. All right.
Sorry about that. Right. So,
Should we just do 15 minutes then, Kev?
yeah. So, a little bit of anxious moment for me. I haven't done breakout rooms for a while. So, I've assigned everyone randomly to breakout rooms. I have split up some of my Essex colleagues into different breakout rooms because I thought that would be useful for you to be kind of like just split up a little bit. So, Katie, is it just a case of me opening them then? And
yes.
Then people move
yeah.
in? Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to press the
Oh,
button.
sorry, I should say, sorry, Kev.
Yeah.
I should say, when we come back, we're going to sort of share a couple of examples. I'm ideally not going to put anybody on the spot, but do please feel that when you're listening to other people, just capture 2 or 3 points that you might be prepared to share in the group coming back.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katie. Right, I'm going to press the button.
I'll just if you don't mind, from the group that I was with, there were 3 examples that were given in some detail. One which was around how to support the trickle down of information from active practice, so GP practices, to the wider primary care network, so physical activity being sort of more across the primary care network. And the example was given where it's not sufficient just to have a kind of tick box exercise, but they want to develop a framework akin to the creating active schools framework, if anyone's familiar with that, to help support that, because it's tangible, actionable and adaptable. And we discussed how those ideas are quite transferable to other things, like I think Hannah mentioned the workplace charter type work. So that was a good one. And then we had a conversation around another example where a community officer, Samaya, has been afforded some protected time to really go out and to support, to gather understanding of and respond to the needs of people with regards to walking and cycling. And sometimes that's led to dead ends. But what she was saying is that sometimes it's led to real positive kind of scenes of activity, which has gained a bit of a critical mass. And then importantly, and something I didn't kind of detail in my example, but she's been able to offer that insight back into the big kind of planners transport. Was it Greater Manchester? No, transport for Blackburn. Transport for Blackburn. So just that, how valuable that is. And then the third example was around, in fact, actually the kind of the sort of follow on from that is that how Jodie in Doncaster might be using that insight that they're gaining about the communities as a leverage point to be in rooms with other system stakeholders to help, not necessarily just about physical activity, but to sort of demonstrate their value in the system so that they can get around the table, and then they've got the opportunity to introduce physical activity into those different settings. So 3 really rich examples with a lot of synergy across and between.
Thanks, Katie. And I was just going to just go ask people's feedback from some of the other breakout rooms as well, if that's okay. So Hannah and Kelly, you were in a breakout room together. There was just 2 of you because obviously some people had left. So did you want to just summarise what you discussed very briefly, if that's okay?
Yeah, thanks, Kev. Just very quickly, we were just talking to Hannah about some of the work that we've been doing with health and social care systems over the last 2 to 3 years, and in particular this one around adult social care. And I suppose some of the changes and some of the stuff I've been noticing is one around the funding element. And actually in the very first year of our prevention enablement model, PEM was funded by predominantly the LDP, and actually we moved into year 2 and that switched. So we've now seen adult social care fund predominantly most of that project, which is a really good starting point, but we've got a lot of work to do to continue to build that business case for future funding. I think the other things that I've noticed as well, particularly with that system, is just how colleagues working within the system are now really utilising physical activity within their own practice. So for example, within care homes, when we've got colleagues going out to do observations and support those care homes, they're going out with physical activity in the back of their minds, and actually how it's been incorporated within the care home setting, enabling the residents to move more, which is not only having an impact on their movement, but also an impact on their dietary intake and their fluid intake as well. So there's lots of great well-being stuff that's happening in that setting, which is really, really nice. So yeah, those were just a few bits that we've really noticed over the last year.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And you don't need to answer it now, Kelly. You know what I'm going to ask now. But so those are great observations. And so the question for us is like, how and why have those changes happened? So, what was the decision making between adult social care where they said, OK, this is good enough for us to invest in it ourselves? Or what's happened within those practitioners that now they feel that physical activity is part of their armoury? Again, you don't need to think about it, but it's what we're encouraging is that next layer down, because that's the bit that we can transfer to another setting, that explanation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Katie. And I'm just conscious we are kind of coming towards the end of the session. So could we just move over to one of the other breakout rooms quickly? Claire, could you just summarise some of the discussions that you and Emily, etc., had in your group? If that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. It's Emily and Hannah in my group. We really focused on Emily's example predominantly. Emily and Hannah, can you kick in if I got this wrong as well? So what Emily was explaining was around the secondment leader model that is used with, is it council leaders, Emily? Is that the right way to describe it? Yep. And really looking to see what the enablers were. And some of the enabling activities were looking at really, really thorough facility reviews that are well thought through, how workshops can be conducted engaging other people, and also presenting materials in really accessible ways, which could relate to and increase physical activity amongst people. And those are seen as enablers of positive change. But within the secondment model approach, and looking at, I think it's Heads of Leisure Trust, Emily, jump in if that's wrong. But there was also this idea around other strong enablers, which were listed as really being that secondment was a strong enabler in itself, role modelling was a strong enabler, and creative engagement was also a strong enabler. So in terms of what we were really trying to understand was about how to really propagate and facilitate the development of those relationships with leaders, and how that might lead to others acting based on those relationships as too. So we were talking about sort of one of the issues with the sort of power of individual differences and personalities, and whether certain leaders may have charisma or personal traits which might be a little bit problematic, as in what you were saying earlier, that we can't just take one of these people and put them here. But one of the things that we did bring into discussion was whether theory can be brought in, for example, looking at a theoretical model of leadership identity change, like Alexander Haslam's model, where we were understanding leaders in terms of leading through us, by us, for us and with us, and whether if leaders themselves understood their behaviours and what makes leaders and what the whole sort of point is, then others could take on some of those characteristics and exemplars and use them to perpetuate enabling activity elsewhere. I think that's right, but could you tell me, Hannah and Emily, if that's utter nonsense?
You got the thumbs up, Claire.
Thank you.
Wowzers.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting as well, because I wrote a little bit of a summary of what Katie said about theory earlier on, and theories in terms of program theories are assumptions and beliefs, but at the same time they can be guided by broader theories, for example, like what you just said, social identity. One that we use a lot is the theory of behaviour change, for example, could also be something that we use a lot. So yeah, that was really great conversation there. So thank you for that. Last group, and correct me if I've got this wrong as well, but it was the guys that had been removed and then came back in. So Laura, is that right? And Laura, and I think it was Lola. and you were in the main conversation in the main room in the end. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So Lola here from Hackney, and we were going to look at a specific example that I shared with the group, although we did talk about other kind of elements of evaluation and how that connects to kind of the whole systems approach. So I use something really specific in relation to our work with delivery partners. So we, a core element of our LDP is about asset-based community development, but it's almost kind of like, okay, so, yes, the assets, but then so what? So there are kind of two key things that have really come out of our learning from phase one, the importance of partnerships, and also the need to think about capacity. And I say that in its broadest sense. So in a sense, what we're trying to sort of understand and build further evidence on is whether kind of the sum is greater than the parts. And so we're doing that sort of the way that we're enabling that is through things like our funding framework, which now has gone beyond investment in delivery and is much, includes investment in learning, in partnership development, in organisational capacity building, creating space for those conversations and connections, connecting the system with each other, connecting those partners with each other, but also connecting them in our local kind of ecosystem and beyond. So with things like national governing bodies, etc., and the role of the LDP team in that space as an enabler to make some of that happen. And so I also shared about some of the constraints, which are around things like not everybody believes in the sum. And so actually some people do want to kind of stay working kind of quite traditional ways. Also the fact that generally quite a lot of broader funding approaches are competitive. So what that means in terms of when you're trying to create a more enabling environment, but actually the very nature of the much wider system is that it can almost contradict what we're trying to do. And that actually the main driver of this work is to say that, yes, we've got fantastic assets, but there is also the need to really strengthen capacity, particularly if they're going to be key partners in the physical activity space. That actually we are working, in order to respond to the diversity of our communities, we are generally working with organisations that are not physical activity organisations. So that capacity building is really, really important. And the long-term aim is to actually then have this kind of core, strong cohort of local diverse providers who can deliver a range of kind of physical activity opportunities to the people that they work with, and that would give commissioners, GPs, a whole range of different stakeholders confidence in their ability to deliver that work. So that's a quick run through of what I shared.
Thanks, Lola. I was just going to say that there's such rich examples, and what we're encouraging really is to be able to get those explicitly kind of outlined in those frameworks and in those theories that connect the two, because even just this conversation, I don't know what everyone else is feeling, but I've just heard lots of similar ideas and patterns arising just from these discussions, and we haven't even set you thinking about the same thing. So it just shows us the potential value of crossing over learning here if we can start to kind of get that detail down around some of these key enablers, some of these key ways of working that you're trying to enact, and some of the particular sort of projects and plans that you have in place. We've run over, Kev.
We have, but I think it's fine because we started probably about 10:05, and the breakout room thing obviously ate into a few minutes and stuff. So I think it's not too bad. So I think it's probably a good time to sum up, if that's okay, Katie. I'll just a quick one from me is I've just posted a question in the chat because myself and Katie and the rest of the NELP team are really keen to sort of get some feedback from you about, how these sessions have been experienced by yourselves and how it's gone for you. And I think in the spirit of reflection, to think about, where do we go next with this? Because what we don't want this to be is this transactional type of exercise where, okay, you've attended a workshop in explanatory frameworks and theories, but this is a journey, and we want to be part of that with you in a nice knowledge exchange environment, which is what this is all about. So any feedback that you have, anything else that you wanted to comment in terms of, are there any additional needs that you might have related to this, that maybe we could continue to develop this type of stuff as part of this work stream, it is great. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Katie.
No, it's just exactly like you said. I wonder, I think we might just send out just a quick survey or something afterwards, not so that it's sort of laborious for you, but just want to get that, to be able to capture how we take this forward and what's going to be useful. And it's just then also a bit of a plug for some of the other workshops that are coming up around building capacity, and also learning clusters that we're starting to get going. So whilst they've all got their different themes, we try this one, the explanatory theory and explanatory framework, is going to sort of have a presence in the others as well. So it's just I don't think we're going to crack it with one shot, but it's just thinking about how we can continue to work together. And ultimately what Kev and I need to do is add value to what you're doing. So that's just an ask from you to just keep on using us as you need.
Brilliant. So I think that's probably a good time. Thank you for those of you who are putting some stuff in the chat now. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Katie, for the presentation and the overview of those two areas that you covered today. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions, and the questioning is fantastic. And obviously some of the conversations that came out of the breakout rooms in such a short period of time, I think is great, and just demonstrates the high quality of thinking that's going on here. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. And I don't know, is there anything else you want to say, Katie?
No, I can let you back to your day jobs now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, go and have a breather.
Thanks all. Kev,
brilliant. Yeah, thanks everybody.